Hi, I'm Deke, a junior at the Sage School, and this is
Maddie Corkery, a sophomore at the Sage School.
We have collaborated to make a podcast on the topic of grazing on public lands.
As a person living in Idaho or even just passing through, I've sure you've seen a cow, or two.
Or maybe one of 2.4 million cows that live in Idaho as of 2018. Almost 2 times the amount of people living here. That's a lot of livestock. These animals seem to be everywhere, around trails, campsites, or just the middle of nowhere.
If you are a person that enjoys the outdoors, you have definitely stumbled across a group of cows or even entire herds of sheep while out hiking, biking, horseback riding, hunting, or whatever your outdoor activity may be.
We know that people have had different experiences with and opinions on these animals, so we set out to find the facts and create an unbiased podcast on the positive and negative sides of public land grazing.
We interviewed experts on both sides of the controversy, hoping to get a clear view into each person's facts and arguments.
We started by interviewing John Marvel, who originally founded the Western Watersheds Project, a nonprofit that works to protect natural habitat and the wildlife that lives in them.
His opinions are based mainly around environmental and wildlife impacts of public grazing.
He begins by speaking of water health.
Several main negative impacts to the environment, the most important of which is damage to riparian areas, which are the green areas next to streams. They spend a disproportionate amount of time in those areas because that's where the grass grows.
Not only do livestock affect life around the water, but life in it.
And both sheep and cattle cause water pollution and their waste byproducts entering into surface waters. Levels of E. coli bacteria from cattle will be 1,000 times higher in August than they are in April. The water is not safe.
Being an avid fisherman, it was interesting to learn that fish can struggle with livestock on public land.
When you have trampling, it produces sediment. Not only clouds the water, making it difficult for fish to breathe, but it also chokes spawning gravel. Extensive cattle grazing has caused many streams to become much wider and shallower. The result is that the water gets too hot for fish to survive.
He moves from explaining underwater health to things living on land. This includes native animals, native plants, and even invasive ones such as cheatgrass.
Cheatgrass is probably the most well-known and intensely invasive plant in the western landscape. It is highly flammable, which is difficult in an environment that struggles with wildfires already, and it can invade grassland communities and displace native plants.
Cheatgrass is spread by cattle when they eat the seeds, and the seeds adhering to their fur. Same with sheep, domestic sheep with their woolly coats.
As he brings up sheep, we learn about them not only spreading weeds and cheatgrass, but fatal diseases.
That domestic sheep carry lung diseases that are fatal when transmitted to Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. They recognize them as cousins and will go up and touch noses with them, and that's how the disease is transmitted.
This has caused their populations to decline from 50,000 to 2,500 within less than 100 years.
And tragedies occur to even more of these native animals, thanks to ranchers' herds we have brought in. A good example is coyotes.
You know about Wildlife Services? It's a federal agency, part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's the agency that kills wildlife to benefit ranchers on public land. They kill between 70 and 90,000 coyotes every year by aerial gunning, denning, use of poison, and cyanide capsules that explode when bitten. They kill wolves, bears, mountain lions. How's that for your tax dollars at work?
Those are some pretty disturbing facts.
Yeah, and it's not even the end of the list of affected animals.
Plants get trampled and eaten to the roots, which makes it difficult for animals like elk, deer, and others to graze.
And ground nesting birds also have troubles with cattle.
We have sandhill cranes. Those are ground nesting birds, and cattle trample their eggs and also have been known to actually eat the eggs.
So if rivers, plants, bighorn sheep, birds, and other wildlife are affected so strongly by public grazing, then why is it still around?
The reason is it's extremely cheap to keep livestock on public land. It's just $1.42 per cow per month, also called AUM. According to Marvel, they profit off of something they barely have to spend any money on in the first place.
The reality is that most public land ranchers are very rich.
Do you think that we should add more to the price per cattle?
Well, that would put them out of business, I think. It should be at least $20. Now it's $1.35.
John Marvel brought up quite a few points regarding the negative side of public grazing.
Though John Marvel believes very strongly in his opinions on public grazing being a negative thing, there are obviously people on the other side of the argument, or even in between.
Our next interviewee is Gretchen Hyde, who works for the Idaho Rangelands Resource Commission.
Her job is to give people a better understanding about grazing on public lands. Though her views are usually very unbiased between ranchers and environmentalists, she did give us several valid points for why public grazing is a positive thing and why we need to keep it around.
Grazing is a natural process of animals and plants. It's an interaction that's happened since the beginning of time. And, herbivores have existed, plants have existed. It's easy to go into a place after grazing and say, oh my gosh. But a lot of times that's exactly what those plants need to really kind of regenerate.
The concern about the environmental effects that cattle have on these land keeps on growing. Gretchen argues that we have nothing to worry about because these ranchers know what they are doing. They don't want to put themselves out of business by overgrazing their land, so this makes them take care of it.
These families have been on here for generations, and they have generations of knowledge of what works and what doesn't. And if they abuse it every year, the land will not be productive. That's basically the definition of overgrazing. So for people to say they overgraze every year, that's not possible. Overgrazing means you're putting yourself out of business.
One of the ways that ranchers care for their land is by using grazing rotation, so that they don't overgraze on these lands.
Upper areas where you have, really productive native grasses, there's times that you want to get in and out. And most of the grazing is short term. There's always a rotation.
She also points out on how many of these issues, such as water pollution, are not always a problem with public grazing, but private grazing instead.
Go back to your fourth grade Idaho history. When the settlers came, they had to get 640 acres of land that they can make a living on. And so what do you think they looked for? What was the first thing they had to have?
Water.
That's where the water is. It's on private land. Public land is, sadly, nobody wants to hear this, but it's kind of what was left over, and it still needed harvested.
She mentions how these private areas are often pictured and portrayed as public land, which can be confusing to the eyes of any general person.
And the challenge is always riparian areas. That's what it always comes down to. Groups like Western Watershed, they focus on that. But a lot of times those areas are private lands, and they're taking pictures of private lands and basically confusing the public that they're talking about public.
Competition between wildlife and livestock is also not an issue.
There's not competition between wildlife and livestock. There's not enough of either one of the animals to do that. We're talking 20 million acres, and there's a lot of leftover forage, and that's why we have so many fires.
So far, she has debunked many of Marvel's ecological points.
Earlier, he also talks about how cheap it is to graze cattle on public lands and how easy it is for ranchers to be rich. Gretchen thinks otherwise.
All their money is tied up in their own business. I kind of always say it's the ultimate nonprofit, because to do ranching right, if they have any profit, they've reinvested it somewhere. They've had to rebuild fence. They've had to, do other things.
And stopping public grazing will damage a huge portion of Idaho's economy.
Multi-billion-dollar industry. Because we have 20 million acres of public lands, we're not going to have that kind of a business anymore at all if we don't have access to public lands. Every ranch is unique. Every allotment is unique. Every connection with the private land is unique. It's a very challenging thing to just generalize and say all good, all bad.
Thank you, Gretchen, for these valuable points and reasoning for why public grazing is a positive thing in our economy and ecology.
We hope that this podcast was able to give you interesting insights and views on both sides of the controversy, public grazing. Both of our interviewees had interesting facts, research, and statistics for why they believe so much in their opinions, and hopefully you have learned as much about this topic as we have.
Thank you to John Marvel and Gretchen Hyde for their time, and of course, thank you, listeners.
Don't try